Kyle. In this section, you are reading a series of works from Plato, and I just want to give you a quick introduction to some of the ways in which Plato represents a significant change in ancient Greece, in philosophy, rhetoric, and basically a new paradigm of the way in which we think about ancient thinkers of this period. Um, so first, I want to acknowledge some challenges in studying Plato. Plato, I mean, none of these texts are, necessarily easy to read, but Plato has some particular challenges. First, in what we call the Socratic problem, and that is that Plato does not write treatises, but instead writes dialogues. And in those dialogues, Socrates speaks, but Plato never speaks. So Socrates was Plato's teacher, and Plato uses that character of Socrates as the primary interlocutor in the dialogues. Uh, so, are we meant to read what Socrates says in these dialogues as what Socrates would have said? Are we meant to read these dialogues and when Socrates speaks as what Plato believes to be fact or true or accurate? There's a problem there, right? So we don't have an easy answer to that. So we call it the Socratic problem because it's something we can debate about and consider and think about in different ways, right? That, of course, ties then to the challenge of dialogues, which include references to people and names of people who were real in Socrates' and Plato's times, and do the things they say represent what they really thought? Are they just tools through which Plato can have Socrates explain the concepts he wants to explain, right? So the problem of a dialogue in general, and particularly its connection to the real world in which it exists, is how are those representations? How accurate are they? Are they rhetorical tools? Because as we see, Plato is someone who is going to denigrate rhetoric in a lot of ways, is clearly a master rhetorician. And one of those challenges then is kind of finding within a dialogue what is it that Plato, as the writer, wants seems to want us to understand about the topics that are under discussion, right? And that connects, of course, to the fact that Plato was not or did not consider himself a rhetor or a rhetorician, but considered himself a philosopher and was interested in teaching philosophy. And rhetoric, because of its prominence in ancient Greece, was something that he had to discuss and certainly something he used, but was not really his focus. So you could get kind of tied into, we're reading these particular dialogues that specifically discuss aspects of rhetoric and other rhetoricians of the time. But ultimately, Plato's goal seems to be philosophical. Philosophical texts are not necessarily easy to read ever, right? Um, and Plato's texts are perhaps more difficult than our contemporary texts because we don't have the same idea about context as we would if we were reading a contemporary text, right? So context matters, as we've discussed in previous areas about the ways in which we can understand women in ancient Greece because of a lack of a lot of that context and a lack of actual texts, and how we have to kind of put together fragments of knowledge and different writers, different records to construct some idea of context for the sophists. But we have that same problem in Plato, right? So we have more context, and you guys already have some of that context because you've been reading the sophists, but we don't know exactly what the context was in which Plato was writing. And so we have to interpret those things, and that leads to multiple and varied interpretations and applications. Some of those interpretations vary significantly because a reading by somebody who's interested in rhetoric might be very different in its focus than somebody who is actually interested in Platonic philosophy, right? So these texts are really open to wide discussion. It means there's no easy answers, which can be frustrating and challenging, but can also be fun and productive. Okay, so one view I'll give of Plato's philosophy, just so you have something to work from. Many of us, or many of you, will have already read some ideas from Plato, most likely the allegory of the cave, which is a common way to think about Plato's idea of the forms and representations and their relationship to reality. So you can think about Plato as an early form of rationalism, which is still a strong current in contemporary philosophy. The idea of rationalism is that we can come to knowledge, or we should come through knowledge primarily through reason, so that we can logically reason to knowledge and ultimately to some kind of, in Plato's idea, some kind of ideal form, some kind of absolute truth that's entirely conceptual and exists outside of the physical world, and particularly outside of the language and forms that we have to represent those concepts and truths. So he separates very much the idea of concepts and truth from the ideas of imitations and experiences. That is, not only are things like language or drawings, which are clearly imitations of things, not truthful, but even our actual experience in the physical world isn't a way to find knowledge. Instead, for Plato, the physical world is like an illusion in which we live, and philosophers are meant to rationalize, reason their way to these a priori truths that pre-exist our existence, that we would have had access to prior to birth and as souls. So our bodies themselves therefore would be imitations. Our soul would be that thing that is closest to truth, that has some existence. And through our reasoning, we can reach back into what we've always already known to access those truths, those foundational concepts, those ideal forms. So in that way, philosophy is a process of reflection on relevant concepts, applying the relevant techniques of reasoning in the pursuit of recollections of the real, right? And so in this case, what's real is not something that's physical. It's not something that's observable. It is instead, right, something that exists within us as people, as humans. So I mentioned that the relationship between Plato and Socrates. Socrates was Plato's teacher. Clearly, Plato held Socrates in great esteem. So one way we can think about Socrates' role in these dialogues is how, in Plato's Apology, Socrates tells the court he is a sort of gadfly given to the state of God. By that, he means a gadfly are those big flies that we see around horses that are like kind of constantly like bugging horses or anybody who is around animals. And so he's like a gadfly. He's just constantly bugging everybody in Athens, given to the state of God, meaning that he feels like it's his duty, his obligation to go around and point out to people how they are incorrect and what they should be doing. And so we can read Plato's dialogues as kind of continuing that mission following Socrates' execution, that Plato's dialogues continue Socrates' work as being kind of the gadfly of Athenian civilization. And Plato's dialogues are pointing at a lot of these kind of annoying all these people who are trained sophists who are focused on that proto-science, where the observable world becomes what's most important and practical rhetoric becomes what's most important. And Plato is like, wait a minute, right? If we want to get to truth, we want to get to the real, we want to get to these ideal forms, we have to do it a different way. So we can see, one way to read these dialogues is to read them as an extension of what Plato depicts as Socrates' goal. So we want to think about Plato and the Sophists. Obviously, we've already seen Sophists kind of arguing within, Isocrates kind of separates himself from those other Sophists. We see some of those other Sophists who are uh, attacking Isocrates as a writer of speeches rather than a giver of speeches. But there's some basic ways that we have come to inherit and one interpretation of the relationship between Plato and the Sophists, right, based on Plato's depiction of these Sophists that he speaks to or speaks about in these different dialogues. So you're reading Protagoras and Gorgias, who are two of the most notable older Sophists. And there's discussion of Lysias, who's a speech writer in the Phaedrus. So according to Plato, then, there's a difference between the oral focus of the Sophists and this shift into literacy that we see in Plato. We already saw that, of course, with Isocrates. Interestingly, Plato still prioritizes orality because it's one step closer to the actual concept, right? If language is another step away in naming the physical world, which is steps away from the ideal forms, a written word is even farther away, right? But Plato exists in a time of much higher literacy. A difference between mythos, or like these imagined religious ideas of the world, right, as compared to truth, which is something that is meant to be reasoned, philosophical, rather than emotional, like religion would be. The Sophists focusing on rhetoric and by extension poetry. Plato focusing on philosophy and really condemning rhetoric and even more so poetry. The Sophists focused on that proto-science where observation of the physical world and description of the physical world becomes kind of where you can identify, where you can get knowledge, where you can learn things by observing the world around us, versus reflection for Plato. Reason as interpretation, right? So if you're observing the natural world, you are trying to interpret like what it means, where it comes from. We're using reason, we're applying reason, but we're applying it for a different purpose. We're applying it to understand the world around us. Reason for Plato is more useful, or should be used, to discover not what's around us, but that reality that exists outside of what's around us. So there's a depiction of the Sophist then as highly subjective. We've seen this in the ways in which the Sophists are described as being interested more in things like winning a case and focused on their own interests, a very practical, useful rhetoric, right? As opposed to an attempt to be objective and to get to some kind of objective truth or reality in the case of Plato. And the result then, the Sophists are depicted as unjust because they're not really interested in what is the good, what is the just, what is the right, what is the ethical, the moral, but are instead interested only in the practical winning of a particular case for a particular end. Whereas Plato's goal are things like justice and good. And so we see these kind of this dichotomy continues to exist in the way we talk about Plato and the Sophists today, though there is, of course, work that attempts to recover and remediate the image of the Sophists, and that tries to interpret and understand Plato in different ways. But ultimately, when I think about Plato's perspective and how it relates to the philosophy and rhetoric as a whole new paradigm, like a complete shift away from how the Sophists, those Ionian immigrants, perspective on proto-science and how that kind of changed the course of ancient Greece, to this new paradigm that will come to be significant all the way through current times. He says in the Phaedrus, for example, Socrates says, we imagine Plato, I am a lover of knowledge, and the men who dwell in the city are my teachers, and not the trees or the country. In other words, that only through dialogue with others and dialectic with ourselves, which is kind of using the Socratic method of having a conversation and asking questions and coming to answers. Um, if we apply that around us, to the people around us, we can get closer to knowledge through those discussions, which allow us to reflect on our own ideas by hearing the ideas of others, right? So that's reason um, kind of practiced in the social setting. And it is a similar kind of approach as Plato's philosophical dialectic, in which the philosopher, him or herself, himself in Plato's time, um, would reflect and basically go through that same questioning process of attempting to analyze and process their own knowledge to get closer to truth. Um, and we will see that, right? So, as you all know, Plato's influence is tremendous in the Western tradition. Karl Popper, a 20th century philosopher, famously said, "The influence, for good or ill, of Plato's work is immeasurable. Western thought, one might say, has been either Platonic or anti-Platonic, but hardly ever non-Platonic." This perspective on kind of what a real philosophy is supposed to look like is established in these ideas that Plato promotes. And so we see different shifts in philosophy throughout the Western tradition that either continue, for example, when early Christian um, doctrine creators adapt and adopt Platonic perspectives. Interestingly, replacing the idea of the ideal forms with the idea of an ideal God, and right, like that is something that is so much bigger and greater and incomprehensible to man, but something we're supposed to strive towards continually. To clear reversals and anti-Platonic measures, for example, during the Enlightenment, when we see a shift towards back towards interpreting the physical world and science. And we see this back and forth, and competing views all the way into the present. So here's some examples. His theory of the form illustrated most clearly in his allegory of the cave, which posits an ideal realm of perfect forms beyond the physical world, is central to his philosophy and has been extensively debated and interpreted by later thinkers. Plato's Republic, which is his most influential, and it's a longer dialogue, explores the concept of an ideal state governed by philosopher kings, significantly influencing discussions about justice, governance, and the role of the intellectual society. If you really want to see what Plato thinks about poets, read the Republic. Plato's use of the Socratic method, a form of dialogue based on questioning and critical analysis, remains a cornerstone of philosophical inquiry. We even see this method adopted for educational purposes in contemporary classrooms. Plato established the Academy in Athens, considered the first institution of higher learning in the West, which fostered a tradition of philosophical dialogue and critical thinking, and really placed philosophy as a centerpiece of what we think of when we think of higher learning. While we've moved away from that in the end of the 20th and into the 21st century towards more practical ends, philosophy underpins a lot of the work we do, even in these practical fields. And finally, many subsequent philosophers, from Aristotle to modern thinkers, are engaging with and building upon Plato's ideas, with some, like Alfred North Whitehead, even referring to Western philosophy as footnotes to Plato. So that's just a quick overview. There's so much more to say about Plato, but we will see what you have to say when you post. Let me know if I can help you in any way.